It's 3 p.m. You're watching SA Today here on SABC News with me, Flo Ledov. In the last hour, we took you to that virtual webinar where the Transport Minister was hosting Taxi Lekgotla about public discourse that's currently still underway. In this hour, we're taking you to another virtual discussion. This past week saw the United Nations Population Fund host a virtual lecture seeking to address the question of development after COVID-19. The lecture series was initiated in 1989 as a tribute to Mr. Rafael M, Salas, who served as the first Executive Director of the UNFPA until his untimely death in 1987. Under his leadership, UNFPA grew into the world's largest provider of multilateral population assistance. This year's iteration was delivered by Lord Mark Malloch-Brown of the UK, who served as Deputy UN Secretary General and Chief of Staff to former UN Chief Kofi Annan. The lecture was moderated by SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues from the United Nations, academia, civil society, philanthropy, and the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 16th Salas Memorial Lecture. This year, we are conducting the lecture virtually for the first time. As we say in my world, the show must go on, with or without a pandemic. And UNFPA rightly felt that it was so important to hold this lecture even in an adapted format. In addition to those joining us on Zoom, the lecture is also being recorded and live streamed around the world. The Salas Memorial Lecture Series was initiated in 1989 as a tribute to Mr. Rafael M, Salas, who served as the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund from the time of the fund's creation in 1969 until his untimely death in 1987. Under his leadership, UNFPA grew from a small trust fund into the world's largest provider of multilateral population assistance. Mr. Salas has been described as a poet, a dreamer, a thinker, a humanitarian, and a superachiever, attributes at the core of working for the United Nations, I'm sure you'll agree, and someone who crisscrossed the globe in search of consensus, something we need today more than ever. Perhaps we might even consider consensus the 18th goal of the SDGs. And it is in that spirit that this lecture series was started to shine a spotlight on development and population issues to help us think big and forge consensus in a changing world. Now, it is my honor to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, United Nations Deputy Secretary General, for her welcoming remarks. Over to you, DSG.
Thank you very much, Sherwin. Dear Lord Malloch-Brown, dear Natalia, dear Ambassador Salas, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and very many friends that I can see coming up on our screen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture. Rafael Salas was the first Executive Director, as we all know, of the UNP Population Fund, who understood very early on the links between population and the broader development issues. In many ways, his thinking foreshadowed the integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. The lecture provides us a really important space to take inspiration from fresh insights as we look forward to achieving our common goals in the decade of action. Mr. Salas was a statesman, and as we heard, a visionary and a poet whose ideas and actions shaped UNFPA from its earliest days and were instrumental in fostering global consensus on population issues. This understanding took hold through the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development that was held in Cairo in 1994, and which continues to guide our work in promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, and ensuring the centrality of health and rights in sustainable development. Since Nairobi, we have seen notable progress. There have been significant reductions in the numbers and the rate of women dying from complications of pregnancy or childbirth. Families are healthier, and young people are more connected and empowered than ever before. But still too many lives are being left behind. Sexual and reproductive health problems are a leading cause of death and disability for women in the developing world, and young people bear the highest risk of HIV infection and unintended pregnancies. Many millions of girls risk the prospect of child marriage and other harmful practices. Now COVID-19 threatens to reverse hard-won gains. UNFPA's projections have shown that owing to disruptions in programs and services, the pandemic could result in millions more cases of child marriage, female genital mutilation, and unintended pregnancy. And we've seen skyrocketing gender-based violence. As we embark on the decade of action to achieve the SDGs by 2030, it is imperative that we don't fall behind and that we address the gaps to achieve gender equality. This is a goal in itself and key to achieving the other 16 goals that we have collectively committed to. And that is why the theme of this year's Salas lecture is so relevant and timely, namely development after COVID-19, stretched resources and strained communities. I can think of no better a person to talk about that topic than today's speaker, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, a global champion for development, for multilateralism, and of course for the United Nations, which was once his home for a number of years. Lord Malloch-Brown is no stranger to many of you here today. During his time at the UN, both as administrator of UNDP and as chief of staff to Kofi Annan, and then as the DSG, he led efforts to ensure that the UN could deliver results that matter. And he understood the value of the UN delivering as one, and was an untiring advocate for human rights, for reform, for peace and security, and most especially for women and for girls. Lord Malloch-Brown's work in the private sector, in government, in philanthropy, and in civil society, including as co-chair of the United Nations Foundation Board of Directors, has supported the paradigm shift to sustainable development, always probing and asking, how can we make the world a more equal place, a more resilient place, a more peaceful place, and how can we live up to our loftiest ideals and goals? As the Secretary General said last month at the General Assembly, COVID-19 is a dress rehearsal for the world of challenges to come, and solidarity is self-interest. And that's why I'm delighted that Lord Malloch-Brown has chosen a topic that can help us to think through the responses to those challenges and reimagine solutions that will be needed for us to keep on track to deliver on the 2030 agenda. Welcome back, Mark. I thank you, and I look forward to engaging and stimulating Rafael Salas Memorial Lecture.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for those remarks, and let me just repeat, solidarity is self-interest. That's something we should all get ingrained in our brains. I would now like to introduce our lecturer, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, who is no doubt familiar to many of you today. Mark is the co-chair of the UN Foundation Board of Directors and senior advisor for the Eurasia Group, and is active both in business and in the non-profit world. He served as Deputy Secretary General and Chief of Staff of the UN under Kofi Annan. For 6 years before that, he was administrator of UNDP. He was later Minister of State in the UK Foreign Office, covering Africa and Asia, and was a member of Gordon Brown's cabinet. He chairs or is on the board of a number of non-profits, including the International Crisis Group and the Open Society Foundation. Lord Malloch-Brown will deliver today a lecture entitled Development After COVID-19, Stretched Resources and Strained Communities. With that, I'm delighted to invite Mark to deliver the 16th Rafael M. Salas lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and Madam Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Canham, Ambassador Salas, and a lot of friends and colleagues, some of whom I got a glimpse of in the gallery screenshot at the beginning. It's wonderful to join you all today. And let me start by saying I think I may be the first lecturer in quite a while to have been lucky to have known Rafael Salas personally. I consider him a mentor, both in my early introduction as a journalist to UN development work, but also through the Philippines, where I was later an advisor to Cory Aquino, who defeated Paeng, as his Filipino friends know him, longtime nemesis Ferdinand Marcos. And that's where I'd like to start today, in the Philippines. Salas's story, a student activist who went to work for the initially reformist Ferdinand Marcos, and then the discreet falling out as the reformer became the autocrat, frames an eternal development dilemma. How do countries push aside special interests and build an inclusive development model with room and a voice for even the poorest Filipino, without one corrupt patronage system being replaced by another? both then in the Philippines and later as administrator of UNDP, I felt part of the answer was functioning democracy at the country level. But in conversations with Rafael Salas, including when I traveled with him to China as a young journalist to report on the two-child family policy, I quickly realized, actually one-child family policy, I quickly realized free choice for poor people is a lot more than an election every 4 or 5 years. It's about gaining the power and voice to make a future for yourself and your family, to find a basic economic security for them, and to access the education that will determine their future. Freedom is about freedom from hunger and ill health, and the freedom to learn as much as it's the freedom to vote. And I learned from watching Salas that delivering that agenda is not a preserve of national actors only. The multilateral system can be a critical champion and catalyst for its delivery. When he left the Philippines to become the population advisor at UNDP, fears of a global population time bomb were rife. Population growth in the global south was exponential. And the spectre of Malthus, whose 1798 paper on how population growth would outrun food and resource supply, so generating a violent correction of the balance between man and nature, hung heavily over all the discussions. Western-dominated development institutions' efforts at population control were seen by many in the South as having the consequence of suppressing non-white demographic growth. This was also the time of the new international economic order, a drive by the leaders of the least developing countries to reset the terms of the global political economy. Efforts to suppress southern population growth in that context sat uncomfortably for some with this agenda. Few, if any, doubted that population growth needed to be addressed. But in the rancorous, distrustful post-colonial era, it was an ambition easily imbued with negative associations. And indeed, use of coercive sterilization, most infamously in India, fed that distrust. Salas changed that. In 1969, Paul Hoffman, the first administrator of UNDP, split out the UN Population Fund from UNDP under Salas as its first executive director. The crafty Hoffman had chosen a national and churchgoer of one of the world's largest and most devout Catholic countries as his agent of change. What Salas did was remove the debate from one of high politics and ideology to that of individual choice. Poor women suddenly had the prospect of some control over their own lives. This was not population as a factor of planetary survival, but rather population broken down to its most intimate individual part, a woman's choice to manage her own reproductive life. Demographic outcomes would be the sum of those individual choices, not of state diktat. The history of UNFPA since has been a steady extension of these services to those most denied them, combined with advocacy on their behalf. From Salas to today, that has been UNFPA's revolution. I salute Comrade Natalia, now leading that demand for choice and so for freedom. For me, years later, as the new head of UNDP, how Salas had changed the terms of the debate was an influence in my own embrace of what became the Millennium Development Goals. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. We needed to democratize development in the same way Salas and his successors had democratized reproductive health. We had to hold a torch for the poor and shine it on the black box of official development assistance. We had to make it accessible and accountable to the poor, while also converting the ivory towers of development policy in New York, Washington, Brussels, Beijing, or elsewhere to a new, simple core development proposition, addressing the basic needs of the poor. In a pre-COVID age, when we still all went to our offices, we saw it as creating a new global water cooler conversation. I should just add that two redoubtable and remarkable partners for me and for UNDP at that time were UNFPA's executive directors, in turn Nafis Sadiq and Thoraya Obaid, both who served during my tenure as
in 1996
development group. At the national level, I imagined an MDG politics, governments measured by their electorates on MDG outcomes. These were to be available in easily accessible reporting formats which would allow comparisons with neighboring communities or countries. And at the global level, the disputes between my previous home, the World Bank, over fiscal adjustment versus a human-focused development championed by my new UN colleagues, or the debates between countries over state-led versus market-led development, would all be subordinated to progress on a single universal scorecard, the MDGs. Now, I just want you to bear in mind these two examples of UNFPA and the MDGs as we turn to the COVID affliction that goes much wider than just its direct tragic health impact. Shortly, I will argue that the crisis has accelerated the moment for another development revolution. Can we seize it? But let's hold that for a moment, because first, COVID. A terrible public health crisis has killed 1 million plus and made tens of millions ill. Nevertheless, today it gives some false comfort. Not all countries have been equally hard hit. Age structure, population density, even debates about certain possible population-wide immunities are raised in explanation of this, as well as, of course, uncertainty about the quality of national statistics. And certainly, decentralized public health systems used to coping with infectious disease and devoted to preventative strategies have proved better in many cases at protecting populations than many highly centralized, expensive, hospital-based care systems. Africa accounts for 17% of the world's population, but only 3.5% of COVID deaths. And above all, observers seem to agree that the quality of government has mattered more than the quantity. The United States, with the most expensive medical system in the world, has had 65 deaths per 100,000 population. Vietnam has had 0.04 deaths per 100,000. However, around the world, the COVID-19 focus of health care has left other vital public health interventions unaddressed, from vaccinations to cancer treatment, the delivery of mother and child health care. Kids everywhere have been out of school, and all the data tells us girls are less likely to return. Across the world, rich and poor, there has been a dramatic shrinking of educational opportunity, and I speak today in the midst of an apparent second wave of the disease, certainly in Europe and North America, probably globally. Yet it is the economic tail to the pandemic that may leave the most lasting damage. The last time this much of the world was in recession was 1870. For a time in late March and April, essentially 85% of the global economy was locked down. Subsequently, the implicit assumption has lingered on that things will bounce back as we discover a vaccine or COVID disappears like the Spanish flu strangely did a century ago. This overlooks a fundamental point about COVID. It's not a random black swan, but rather a highly predictable occurrence. In many ways, the disease of globalization, modern travel, quickly carried it to all corners of our integrated global economy. Two quick but thoughtful books rushed out by their authors to tell us what will or should happen next. Both quote Lenin. Sometimes nothing changes for decades. At others, decades of change can happen in weeks. The world is not going back to be the same as it was before. the massive destruction of both the supply and demand side of our economies has caused damage. Jobs, firms, and whole economic sectors have been lost that won't come back. Bounce back in demand as lockdowns have been lifted has been euphorically greeted as a recovery, but it's well short of full recovery. World GDP has shrunk by around 5% this year. The ILO estimated a drop in global working hours during the second quarter equivalent to the loss of 400 million full-time jobs. Women workers have been hit particularly hard because of their overrepresentation in the worst hit sectors. Additionally, there's been a massive contraction in informal sector employment, in remittance earnings, and the undermining of the whole support system that keeps those on the brink of falling back into poverty from doing so. The World Bank estimates that 115 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty. That's less than $1.90 a day. As Bill and Melinda Gates have put it, quote, "We have been set back about 25 years in the course of 25 weeks." Statistics never capture it all. So let me recount briefly one woman's story from the Gates Foundation supported project Pathways, which follows the lives of ordinary Kenyans. Sylvia from Homer Bay on Lake Victoria was born with HIV and lost both her parents to it. She's the proud and loving mother of a 4-year-old daughter, Gift. That name speaks volumes about how much she means to her mother. Sylvia earned a living as a counsellor at the HIV clinic for affected mothers, where she is herself a patient. Now they can no longer afford to pay her. Her treatment, Septrin, is still available, but at 30 Kenyan shillings or 28 cents a dose over a month. That is twice her rent. Her landlord, an old family friend, is usually understanding, but now he has money troubles of his own, so is demanding to be paid. She tries to earn some cash by washing clothes and braiding hair, but the customers can't pay her. And Gift is now out of school. Very differently, last week, British Airways retired its last 2 Boeing 747s. The jumbo jets were once almost synonymous with long-haul business and leisure travel, making dozens of transatlantic trips daily. When at UNDP, I sometimes thought I spent more nights on them than in my own bed. The airlines don't anticipate passenger levels recovering to pre-pandemic levels till 2024 or later. In most Western capitals, a widespread collapse of both commercial and home real estate prices is anticipated. We may be enabled by Zoom and its competitors, and it's changing the anatomy of work in direct ways. I'm talking to you from my home outside London, let alone from New York. It's unlikely the pendulum will swing as far from big city life, though, as some predict. It's a brave forecaster or killjoy who would count New York City out. I first worked at the UN in New York in 1976. Taxes, broken services, and crime seemed to be its death sentence. We who made it our home in the years since know how wrong those doom-mongers were. But even a partial shift from how things were spells major economic consequences for developing countries. Globalization, as we know it, had already begun the long unravel. For much of the decade, trade as a percentage of global GDP has plateaued. Already, the increasingly hostile and defensive competition for spheres of influence and commercial dominance between China and the US was leading to a reordering of supply chains and investment decisions. That's been accelerated by COVID as business leaders have started to think in terms of supply chain resilience rather than efficiency alone. It may still be cheaper to source from China, but is it commercially prudent or politically expedient to be exclusively dependent on a source that is increasingly caught up in confrontation with, for many global companies, their most important stakeholder, the US? Compounding these supply chain changes is the growing corporate and governmental response to climate change. I talk to a lot of boards and managements about climate risk. The big initial takeaway from COVID was elation at getting nature back. As an Indian friend told me, as the smog lifted, you could see the Himalayas again from Amritsar. Peacocks were back on the streets of Mumbai. Temporary but heart-lifting gains from the stilling of traffic everywhere. Then came the regret. We should have seen this coming. What's the next such crisis? Earlier in Australia and currently still in California, devastating fires plus brutal hurricane seasons elsewhere have led businesses everywhere to wake up if they hadn't before. Events like floods in Bangladesh, nothing new, but again worsening after years of improved flood management, or a long drought in South Africa's Cape Province have brought home the challenge. The UN Foundation, which, as you heard, I'm proud to co-chair under Ted Turner, has, with many other groups, led the push towards greater shareholder and institutional activism. Annual meetings of companies have become an uncomfortable moment of climate accountability for many boards. However, with businesses everywhere also facing liquidity and solvency stress because of COVID, these pressures alone might not be enough to make them invest in new business models, except that governments too have stepped up, similarly recognizing that climate is the next COVID. The Eurasia Group analysts estimate that governmental recovery packages around the world are running 2-to-1 in terms of support of a green versus brown recovery. The underlying direction is clear. Governments and corporates are increasingly aligned behind a green transition. President Xi of China galvanized the official climate change world with his words at the UN General Assembly in September. We aim to have emissions peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. As Adam Tooze, the economic historian, observed, quote, with these two short sentences, China's leader may have redefined the future prospects for humanity. With governments doubling down on green bets, green infrastructure as a recovery strategy, and green technologies as a longer-term competitiveness strategy, businesses are climbing on board. The commercial logic is increasingly compelling. I chaired the Business Commission for Sustainable Development. Our principal report, Better Business, Better World, argued that sustainable business models could unlock more than $12 trillion in new market value and create 380 million new jobs by 2030. Business models that embrace a circular economy and shared ownership offer dramatic business opportunity. For example, the current life of a privately owned car is a quiet one, on average parked and idle for up to 90% of the time. A business model that delivers shared ownership of that car is a win-win for the owners, who share the cost, the environment, and the business provider. Overshadowing all the opportunities that we identified was the seismic shift from fossil fuels to renewables. Now that shift is gathering unstoppable momentum. Today's renewables have a lower capital and operating costs than traditional fuels. And as a rule of thumb, every $1 million invested in renewables generates 7 or more jobs, whereas the same amount in coal is 1 to 2 jobs. Coal, as Mark Carney, the Secretary General's Special Envoy on Climate Financing, has declared, is now a stranded asset. Investors and lenders beware. That said, the pace of transition from fossil fuels seems likely to be slower in the global south as energy demand ramps up. And that's despite its frequent advantages of weather and geography in terms of solar, wind, and hydro. And as Europe prepares to set tariff standards for imports that have generated carbon emissions at their point of origination, the rate of transition to renewables may become a highly contested political issue. A two-class energy world of smokestacks in the south and windmills in the north may seem to turn history on its head, but it carries political, trade, and health risk we would do well to avoid. Let me return for a moment to that world of a temporarily reduced economic pie. GDP will be smaller for some years to come. Within that, countries will have a very uneven capacity to protect themselves. Governments have, during the crisis, provided some $12 trillion of support to firms and households. However, whereas in rich countries, these measures amounted in many cases to a double-digit percentage of GDP, in the poorest countries, it was often a couple of percent at best. While emerging market economies were able to access the debt markets for the financial equivalent of ventilator support, raising some $124 billion since March, not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa, as Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, reported in a speech last week, has been able to access the international debt markets in this period. She went on to say, quote, "This calamity is far from over. All countries are now facing what I would call the long ascent, a difficult climb that will be long, uneven, and uncertain, and prone to setbacks. We are all joined by a single rope, and we are only as strong as the weakest climbers." The IMF estimates global public debt will equal 100% of GDP in 2020 and leave heavy job losses, bankruptcies, and an impact on people of impaired health and education services. For UNFPA and the wider UN family, the case for a multilateral fight back, Kristalina's single rope that holds us all, might have rarely seemed more needed. And the performance of a UNFPA endorsed by record levels of donor support, or WFP with its handsomely earned Nobel Peace Prize, or the prominence in government and corporate discussions of the SDGs would seem to suggest a UN in fighting form for the task. But the reality is a bit different. The UN's 75th General Assembly showed a UN membership increasingly divided between big powers who seem to have imbibed the Kool-Aid mantra of their own country first, and smaller powers that amidst growing turbulence cling more firmly than ever to the life raft of multilateralism. In the development and humanitarian space, we simply can't wait for these wider questions of the UN's future political legitimacy to resolve themselves. You need to be relevant today. You are needed. That requires understanding of what post-COVID development will look like and your place in it. The Economist this week offered its own prediction. Quote, "The pandemic will leave economies less globalized, more digitized, and less equal. Within countries, service jobs may move from cities to suburb. Sectors like technology will explode, others will fall back. ExxonMobil has already dropped out of the top Dow Jones ranking. Oil stocks everywhere are broadly down 30%, and renewables up 30%. Among countries, too, there will be new winners and losers. After it's all over, The Economist again suggests America may quite quickly recover its levels of economic output, but China will even more quickly be 10% bigger than it was before, and Europe smaller. Among developing countries, there'll be a similar story of cards shuffled. Some will benefit from supply chain diversification. Others will suffer from overseas consumer spending constraints on their garment and other export sectors, or as remittance earnings fail to recover. Some countries will seize new opportunities in fintech to revolutionize financial service access. Others will accelerate the shift to renewables, and still others will find their own niches as everything from tourism to services and manufacturing and agriculture is remade to shorten and diversify supply chains, increase sustainability, and emphasize ethical and, for that matter, organic supply chains. It will be a brave but smaller GDP world out there. And so in addition to encouraging countries and companies to seize the opportunity of change, there will also be a need to help with the transition costs, the safety nets and retraining for those left behind by these changes. The poverty map will be different as places and groups are thrown back into agonizing poverty and others gather economic speed. And the international aid agencies will be less well-resourced perhaps to respond. As always in a crisis, donor countries are feeling pressure to bring spending back home. Those donors who calculate their aid volumes as a percentage of their GDP will find an opportunity to cut spending. And as the new US-China Cold War, if that is what it tragically proves to be, gathers pace, there will be pressures that we will have not seen since the 1980s to use aid as a political patronage tool to build loyalty in a two-block world. Never good news for aid effectiveness. So how do development actors such as yourselves navigate this new world? First, as I've said, read the map. Just as rich world governments will trim their aid flows, in developing countries, higher levels of public debt and lower revenues means smaller government seems likely. But as this crisis has shown in the success of, say, Singapore, which has low government spending to GDP, quality and priorities can matter more than size. In its case, a laser-like focus on education and an investment in a top-class cadre of policymakers has paid for itself many times over. So we need to re-engage the debate about what kind of government developing countries need. Too many governments, North and South alike, simply don't pass the competency test. COVID has shown them up. Whatever its size and wherever the country, it's a safe bet that citizen expectations of government will have changed. There will be less talk about lower tax and free markets and more about resilient social safety nets and health and education systems that are fit for purpose. The Reagan-Thatcher model of open markets and a small state seems up to challenge. The Scandinavian, Northern European model has had a better crisis than the Anglo-Saxon US-UK one. And a number of Asian countries such as South Korea, Vietnam, or indeed New Zealand have had a much better crisis still. And as I said at the start, low-cost preventative healthcare systems in West Africa or parts of Asia have outperformed many of the big private or public health systems that were seen as poster children in the past. There is likely to be profound shifts in where we look for successful models in the future. And where we do still look primarily to governments for service delivery, it may be mayors and cities or other subnational actors as much as national institutions. The success of Germany in its COVID response is attributed by some to a decentralized, city-controlled public health system. The C40 gathering of mayors has proved a more dynamic global force in many ways than its plodding state counterparts. At UNF, we're proud of our support to a group of US state governors that have kept their states on track for emissions reductions in line with the Paris Agreement, even as Washington has trashed and exited the agreement. The private sector, in its many shapes and forms, from multinationals to SMEs and the local informal sector, will be even greater shapers of development opportunities and challenges as they remake economies, disrupting old industries and making new ones. It will take them further into previously public sector-led areas like health and education delivery. More than ever, they will be the major providers of jobs. This is exciting because of the prospects for innovation and growth, and frightening because where is the accountability? For a citizen, a corporation can be even more impenetrable than a government. It will also raise profound ethical questions about data protection and access of poor people to digitized services they cannot afford. Issues of citizen opportunity versus citizen exclusion could become the new class or caste war of politics. And the answers aren't always easy. In part, China beat the pandemic faster and more thoroughly than the West because of its unrestricted access to personal data. It's able to deploy big data and AI in ways the West, with a focus on data privacy, has disallowed. The rest of the world will have to make their own choices between effectiveness and privacy. China, it might be said, gave their citizens health protection at the expense of data protection. National civil society is likely to be a growing force too in service provision, and also in the battle for rights in developing countries. As I've said, post-COVID government is going to be resource-strapped. Where it could not provide good health or education systems before the crisis, it's unlikely to do so afterwards. Not for the first time, civil society is likely to fill the space, particularly in provision for marginalized groups. As national civil society has grown, so has its intellectual leadership and soft capital, and so has the diversification of its funding model. BRAC, the Southern NGO I'm lucky enough to know best as a board member, has grown into a sophisticated force, both in Bangladesh, where it has more than 90,000 staff, and abroad. At home, in addition to its core activities in frontline health and education service provision, it has a microfinance operation with a loan book in the US billions, a large mobile fintech business, a bank, an extended and profitable range of social enterprises from craft garments to bull semen, skills training centers, and a prominent university. The funding model combines donor flows with revenue streams from these other activities. Abroad, through TED, they've won an audacious grant from a group of prominent philanthropists to spearhead the international promotion of their ultra-poor graduation program. This draws on a continuous process of research evaluation and program improvements, as described in the work of the Nobel economist laureates Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, the work about creating highly individualized interventions to put communities and individuals on the path to sustainable livelihoods. I report this not as an advertorial, but rather as one example of how the development ecosystem has changed. If there ever was, there certainly is no longer a monopoly of wisdom or practice anymore for UN agencies or Western INGOs. Whether it is BRAC or, say, the White Helmets in Syria, best practice is found in the front lines of our work, not the donor capitals of old. The UN funds and programs can be partners and cheerleaders of this change. I see this in Bangladesh in the partnership of the resident coordinator, Mia Seppo, and her country team have with BRAC. So for UNFPA and its UN sisters, a new environment, new partners, but new challenges, renewed poverty and inequality, indebted government and indebted and weakened government in many places, a private sector remaking economies for better and worse, a more empowered set of local partners, and the UN itself facing this landscape with tightened resources. In closing, some compass points for that future. Engage in the debate about what good will look like after the pandemic. What are the lessons of COVID response? What worked and what didn't in the health field? Which are the delivery models that need to be emulated? What is the preferred public-private model of health delivery? In an era of weaker government and dependence on a network of other commercial and not-for-profit health delivery systems, how does UNFPA ensure that poor women continue to receive affordable reproductive health support? There are tried, if not always effective, means to hold government to account for health services to the poor. As non-public provision increases, how do we hold the new providers to account? They're more elusive and scattered than a national health ministry, and often a lot more opaque. When rights in general seem likely to come under pressure, UNFPA must ensure its agenda for teenage girls, women and children is protected. hold on to the SDGs as a critical organizing and campaigning framework. Amina Mohammed has done a fantastic work in establishing their global significance with help from so many of you. And the crisis has revalidated their relevance, and at this point, they enjoy the endorsement of governments, the private sector, and civil society. They draw on the UN's convening power for their inspiration, but also for driving forward their progress. And finally, on these points, never forget those that are left behind or left out. When in 1969, Rafael Salas established the UN Population Fund, he turned on its head how the UN addressed population. It was suddenly, as I said at the beginning, not a geopolitical issue, but a matter of woman's choice. Development was made personal, taken from the conference rooms of Turtle Bay to the simplest bedroom in the poorest villages of the poorest countries. It was an expression of solidarity, but also of respect. It was putting power in the hands of the most marginalized individual, the poorest women. In an environment that has changed for all of us, Madam Executive Director, you must again find the key that opens to where people can be in charge of their own lives, the ultimate test of development. Thank you.
I thank Lord Mark Malloch-Brown for his intervention, for that lecture, and I'll just remind those that might have just joined us that that was under the title Development After COVID-19, Stretched Resources and Strained Communities. So I'm just going to do a quick recap before we move on in the program. He talked about how Rafael Salas focused on an inclusive development model, population broken down into its intimate parts. Salas changed the terms of the debate, addressing basic needs of the poor, development made personal. COVID created circumstances, and I'm sure the DSG and UN officials will like this one. It created the circumstances for a developmental revolution. The world is not going back to what it was before. Women have been hit disproportionately hard due to them working in the sectors at the front lines that have been hardest hit. Mark quoted Bill and Melinda Gates. I'm going to quote Mark quoting Bill and Melinda Gates. We've been set back 25 years in the course of 25 weeks. He talked and highlighted the importance of how business models are changing and that they need to deliver shared ownership. The race towards renewables could become a political issue. All countries facing a difficult ascent. We're all joined by a single rope. I quite like this, but we're only as strong as the weakest climbers. And the Secretary General also talks about this in the context of healthcare as it relates to COVID-19, Mark, that we are only as strong as our weakest health system. He also talked about nationalism versus multilateralism, a brave but smaller GDP world out there. The poverty map is going to change after COVID. If the US-China Cold War accelerates, it's bad for everybody. He raised the question, what kind of governments do developing countries need? He talked about the private sector, how they will remake economies and industries and making new ones, and the ethical questions we have to ask around that. What about the ethics around that? He said the development ecosystem has changed. Best practices found at the front lines of our work, not in donor capitals. Engage in the debate about what good looks like after this pandemic. Hold on to the SDGs. Never forget those who are left behind. And I'll give the floor to Dr. Natalia Cunham for any closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Sherwin. I'd like to thank all the participants from all around the world for your presence today, and certainly the panelists, but most of all, the lecturer, Lord Malloch-Brown, who rose magnificently to the occasion and delivered a challenging and very thoughtful lecture. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to also add a word of gratitude to the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, to Ambassador Skog, to Kessie Ekomoswanye, and a special thanks to Menchu, Ambassador Salas, for keeping Mr. Salas's legacy and his vision alive. It's something that all of us at UNFPA endeavor to do every day in our work. And I must congratulate our brilliant moderator, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and appreciate all UN staff. Today, the lecture has been a testament to the spirit and the intent of the Salas lecture. it's also a reminder to us of what it's going to take to really leave no one behind. The pandemic is holding up a magnifying glass, and we're seeing the deep inequalities. We're seeing all the isms, including racism, which persist throughout societies. And still, the pandemic gives us an opportunity to reset. We should not allow COVID-19 to dictate our future course of action. We need to march forward. The SDGs, yes, remain our blueprint, and for UNFPA, there really can be no sustainable development goals without the antecedent ICPD, that International Conference on Population and Development, and its platform, and the international community that it represents. NGOs were present in Cairo 26 years ago, as they were in Beijing the year later. At this moment, we have to admit that the international community is stretched, that resources are strained, and our resolve has to match that. Our resolve has to get firmer day by day. Our achievement of the rights of women and girls should get closer with every act of solidarity. And there is no strength without unity. So let us seize every opportunity. Let us open our minds. Let us open our investment attitude. And let us reach out, even if it's a virtual reach out across the aisles. Because there's a 12-year-old girl who is counting on us wherever she may be. And together, I really believe that we can deliver on her rights, her choices, her future, her hopes, and her dreams. Thank you very much for joining.
I thank Dr. Cunham for her remarks and for everyone's participation in this event. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture. I'm told we had about 900 people watching, which is something in this virtual world, 900 people watching proceedings online. It's been a real pleasure being your moderator. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.